They laughed when the elderly woman covered her house with sand, but when they discovered the reason, Mrs. Dorothy Mitchell felt the weight of her 72 years with every wheelbarrow of sand she dumped around her house. The neighbors in the small town of St. Mary's Ridge, Virginia, would stop on the sidewalks to whisper and point, some laughing openly at the scene that had repeated every day since the beginning of the month. It was a spectacle no one could understand. Every morning, promptly at 6 o'clock, the grey-haired woman with unshakable determination would leave her house wearing her faded blue jacket and grey wool cap, pushing a wheelbarrow loaded with sand. Trip after trip, she dumped the contents around her modest 100-year-old wooden house, creating an increasingly high barrier that already covered almost the entire lower part of the walls. The routine had begun 3 weeks ago, right after a city council meeting that few residents had followed. Mrs. Dorothy had been present, sitting in the last row, listening attentively to every word from the council members. When she returned home that night, something had changed in her expression. The tranquility that had always characterized her gestures was replaced by a silent urgency, a haste that no one could explain. The next day she appeared at Mr. Harold's building supply store, asking to buy all the sand he had in stock. When Harold asked if she was doing some construction work, she only replied that she needed to protect what was hers. The merchant, who had known her for decades, thought it was strange but didn't question it. After all, Mrs. Dorothy had always been a woman of few words and much action. The first truckload of sand arrived on a Tuesday morning. The truck unloaded everything in front of the house, creating a golden mountain that caught the attention of every passerby. Mrs. Dorothy thanked the driver, paid in cash, and immediately began transferring the sand, wheelbarrow by wheelbarrow, around her property. Martha Johnson, her next-door neighbor, was the first to question. "Dorothy, what are you doing with all this sand?" "I'm protecting my house," replied the elderly woman without stopping her work. "Protecting it from what?" "From those who shouldn't meddle with what isn't theirs." The enigmatic answer only increased the neighborhood's curiosity. Soon, small groups of people formed, who passed by just to see the progress of the mysterious work. Some bet that Mrs. Dorothy was becoming senile. Others speculated she wanted to make a different kind of garden. There were even those who said she was hiding something under the house. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The jokes weren't long in coming. Joe from the tavern, known for his sharp tongue, started calling Mrs. Dorothy the Sand Woman. He told anyone who would listen that the old lady was building a private beach in the middle of Virginia. Betty, the bakery owner, commented to her customers that this was something done by people who had nothing better to do with their lives. But Mrs. Dorothy didn't care about the comments. She continued her daily routine, leaving the house very early, even before the sun had fully risen, and working until mid-morning. Then she would retreat inside, only appearing again in the late afternoon for a few more wheelbarrow loads. The situation became complicated when the second truckload of sand arrived. This time, Mrs. Dorothy didn't have enough money to pay up front. She had to ask Mr. Harold to put it on her tab, promising to settle up at the end of the month when she received her pension. The merchant agreed, but grew worried. He knew his customer's financial situation well and knew she wasn't swimming in money. "Mrs. Dorothy, are you sure you need all this sand?" asked Harold, trying to be delicate. "I do, Mr. Harold, and I'll need even more. But this is going to cost a fortune. You've already spent almost your entire pension for this month. Money comes and goes. What I'm protecting doesn't." The conversation reached the ears of Jennifer, Mrs. Dorothy's only daughter, who lived in Richmond working as a lawyer at a corporate law firm. When she learned of the situation, she was furious. She called her mother several times, but Mrs. Dorothy always gave evasive answers, saying only that she was taking care of things around the house. Jennifer decided to pay a surprise visit the following weekend. When she arrived in the small town of St. Mary's Ridge and saw the state of her mother's house, she nearly had a heart attack. The century-old wooden house, an inheritance from her great-grandparents, was practically buried up to the middle of the windows. Mounds of sand were spread all over the property, giving the place a completely surreal appearance. "Mother, what is this madness?" shouted Jennifer, getting out of the car in a state of shock. Mrs. Dorothy was in the backyard, organizing tools for another day of work. She looked at her daughter calmly, as if she had been expecting that visit. "Hi, dear. Did you have a good trip?" "Don't you give me that soft talk. What on earth have you done to our house?" "I'm protecting it." "Protecting it from what? Have you completely lost your mind?" Mrs. Dorothy took a deep breath and set down the shovel she was holding. She looked at Jennifer with those tired eyes that carried the stories of a whole lifetime. "Sit here with me, dear. I need to tell you something." "I don't want to sit. I want to know what happened to you. The neighbors are laughing at you all over town." "Let them laugh. When they find out the reason, they'll stop." "What reason? What is this secret you won't tell me?" Mrs. Dorothy was silent for a few seconds, as if carefully choosing her words. "They want to take our house, Jennifer." "Who wants to take our house? What are you talking about?" "The city council approved a project. They want to expropriate this entire block to build a shopping mall. Our house is right in the middle of the land they chose." Jennifer felt her legs go weak. She approached a plastic chair and sat down heavily. "What do you mean? Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because I know how you are. You'd want to sell right away, take the compensation money and be done with it. But I'm not leaving here, dear. This house has history. It has roots. It has things that can't be lost." "Mother, if what you're saying is true, you can't just cover the house with sand and think that solves the problem. There are laws, there's justice." "Justice?" Mrs. Dorothy gave a bitter laugh. "Dear, you live in the capital. You don't know how things work in a small town. When they want something, they get it. The only way to protect what's ours is to not let them get close." Jennifer spent the rest of the weekend trying to convince her mother to stop this madness and find a lawyer to resolve the situation legally. But Mrs. Dorothy remained unyielding. Every time her daughter mentioned the possibility of selling the house and moving to a better place, the elderly woman became even more determined in her mission. "You don't understand, Jennifer. This house cannot be sold. It cannot be destroyed. There are things here that are more important than money." "What things, Mother? It's just old bricks and wood." "No, dear, it's not just that. There is history buried here, our family's history, history that cannot be lost." "Are you talking about old furniture, photos, documents? Then we take all of that and move it somewhere else." Mrs. Dorothy shook her head sadly. "It's not that kind of thing, dear. It's something that cannot be moved, something that has to stay exactly where it is." Jennifer returned to Richmond even more worried than before. During the week, she called neighbors several times asking for news about her mother. All the information she received was discouraging. Mrs. Dorothy continued buying sand and covering the house, apparently spending her entire retirement on that insane project. The situation worsened when Daniel, Mrs. Dorothy's grandson and Jennifer's son, decided to spend his school vacation with his grandmother. The 15-year-old boy had always had a special relationship with Mrs. Dorothy and became fascinated with the sand project. Instead of trying to dissuade her like everyone else, Daniel began to help. Every morning, even before the sun had fully risen, grandmother and grandson worked together. Daniel pushed the wheelbarrow more easily than the elderly woman, allowing them to transport twice as much sand in the same time. Mrs. Dorothy was moved by the unexpected help. "Why are you helping me, my grandson? Everyone thinks your grandmother has gone crazy." "Because I trust you, Grandma. If you're doing this, you must have an important reason." "I do, Daniel, a very important one. One day you'll understand everything." The complicity between grandmother and grandson deeply irritated Jennifer when she discovered the situation during one of her weekly calls. On a Friday night, she appeared again in St. Mary's Ridge, this time determined to put an end to that story once and for all. "Daniel, pack your things. You're leaving with me right now." "Mom, I want to stay with Grandma." "You are not staying here participating in this madness. Your grandmother is sick and needs medical help, not a teenager encouraging her fantasies." Mrs. Dorothy, who had remained calm until then, became agitated for the first time. "Jennifer, you are not taking my grandson away. He's the only person who understands I'm doing something important." "You are not doing anything important. You're spending all your money on a sick obsession, and on top of that, you're dragging my son into this mess." Your son is learning what it means to protect the family, something you seem to have forgotten." The argument escalated until Mrs. Dorothy, at the height of emotion, uttered a sentence that left Jennifer and Daniel perplexed. "They can't take what's buried here." Jennifer stopped shouting and looked at her mother with an expression of astonishment. "What's buried here? What are you talking about?" Mrs. Dorothy realized she had said too much. She looked at her grandson and then at her daughter, took a deep breath and said, "I can't explain now, but when the right time comes, you'll both understand everything." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Jennifer took Daniel away that same night, but the boy was restless during the entire trip back to Richmond. He knew his grandmother wasn't crazy. He knew Mrs. Dorothy too well to believe she would do something meaningless. There was something more to that story, something the adults weren't able to see. The following Monday, Daniel skipped school and took a bus to St. Mary's Ridge. When Jennifer discovered her son had run away, she became desperate. She called her mother, shouting on the phone, threatening to call the police. "If you don't send my son back immediately, I'll sue you for kidnapping." "No one kidnapped anyone, Jennifer. Your son came here because he wanted to, and I won't force him to go back." "You've completely lost your mind." "I'm coming there to get my son, and then I'm having you committed to a psychiatric clinic." Mrs. Dorothy hung up the phone and looked at Daniel, who had heard the entire conversation. "Are you sure you want to stay here, my grandson? Your mother is very angry." "I'm sure, Grandma, but I think the time has come for you to tell me the truth. What is buried here?" Mrs. Dorothy sat on the house's porch, partially hidden by the mounds of sand that now covered almost all the ground floor windows. She motioned for Daniel to sit beside her. "Daniel, our family has a story I never told your mother, a story my grandmother told me when I was your age, and that her grandmother told her when she was young." "What story, Grandma?" "This house wasn't always ours, Daniel. When my great-grandfather built it over 100 years ago, he didn't build it on empty land. He built it on top of something that already existed." "On top of what?" Mrs. Dorothy took a deep breath, as if preparing to share the biggest secret of her life. "Beneath this house, Daniel, is buried the history of people who were forgotten, people who lived here long before our family, people who never had the right to a proper funeral, to a place to rest in peace." Daniel's eyes widened, trying to process what he was hearing. "Are you talking about a cemetery?" "Not exactly a cemetery, my grandson. It was a place where enslaved people were buried when they passed from this life, people who worked and suffered on this land for generations, but who never had their names remembered, their stories told." "And how do you know this?" "Because my great-grandmother was the child of one of those people. She was born back in the times of slavery, right here on this land. When they built the house, she made my great-grandfather promise he would never disturb what was underneath, and that promise passed from generation to generation until it reached me." Daniel was silent for a few minutes, absorbing the magnitude of what he had discovered. "And you never told this to my mother?" "I tried to tell her when she was a child. But you know your mother. She was always very practical, very focused on the future. She said it was nonsense to dwell on the past. Over time, I stopped bringing it up." "But Grandma, if what you're saying is true, then it's not just our house that's in danger. It's the memory of all those people." "Exactly, Daniel. That's why I can't let them demolish this house. I can't let them destroy the only place in the world where these people are resting." As grandmother and grandson talked on the porch, a car stopped in front of the house. Jennifer got out furiously, accompanied by a man in a suit whom Daniel didn't know. "Mother, I brought Dr. Richard. He's a psychiatrist. I've come to get my son and arrange for your hospitalization." Mrs. Dorothy stood up slowly, with the dignity of someone who knew she was doing the right thing. "Jennifer, you can bring as many doctors as you want. I'm not leaving this house and I won't stop protecting it." Dr. Richard approached with a professional smile. "Mrs. Dorothy, I'm Dr. Richard. Your daughter told me about the situation. Why don't we talk a little about what's happening here?" "Doctor, I don't need to talk about anything. I'm in my house, on my property, doing what I think is necessary to protect what is mine. But Mrs. Dorothy, covering a house with sand is not something—" how can I say, normal. Is there a special reason for this? Daniel stood up and stood beside his grandmother. Yes, there is, Doctor, and it's a very important reason. Jennifer looked at her son with irritation. Daniel, stay out of this conversation. Let's go now. I'm not leaving, Mom. Grandma is protecting something bigger than us, something you should know about, too. Daniel, your grandmother is sick. She's making up stories to justify irrational behavior. Mrs. Dorothy looked at Jennifer with deep sadness in her eyes. Daughter, I have never lied to you in my entire life. Why do you think I would start now? At that moment, another car arrived. It was Mr. Anthony, Mrs. Dorothy's neighbor for over 40 years. He came running with a worried expression. Mrs. Dorothy, you need to know something urgent. What happened, Mr. Anthony? I was at the town hall early this morning sorting out an issue with my documents, and I overheard the mayor on the phone. They're sending the machine here tomorrow morning to remove all this sand by force. Jennifer made a relieved expression. Thank goodness, it was about time someone took action. But Mrs. Dorothy turned pale. She held onto Daniel's arm to steady herself. Tomorrow morning? That's right, Mrs. Dorothy. And they said if you resist, they'll call the police force to remove you from the property. Dr. Richard took advantage of the tense moment to move closer to Mrs. Dorothy. Mrs. Dorothy, you can see the situation is getting complicated. Why not accept our help? We can resolve this in a calmer way. Doctor, you don't understand. They can't touch this house. They can't destroy what's underneath here. What's underneath here? Asked Jennifer, already losing patience. Daniel looked at his grandmother, asking permission with his eyes. Mrs. Dorothy hesitated for a moment, but then gave an affirmative nod. Mom, underneath our house is buried our family's history, the history of our ancestors who were enslaved. Grandma is protecting a sacred site. Jennifer let out a sarcastic laugh. Daniel, are you going crazy too? What is this story about enslaved ancestors? Our family has always been free laborers. Mrs. Dorothy approached her daughter and spoke with a firm and solemn voice. Jennifer, your great-great-grandmother was the daughter of an enslaved woman named Harriet. She worked this land for over 50 years, from childhood until she grew old. When she passed from this life, she was buried right here, along with many other people in the same condition. There was no cemetery for them, there was no dignity for them. The only thing left was this piece of land where they rest. Dr. Richard exchanged a look with Jennifer, as if they were mutually confirming that Mrs. Dorothy was indeed delusional. Mrs. Dorothy, those are very old stories. How can you be sure they are true? Because my grandmother took me to see the exact spot when I was 12. She showed me where each person was buried. She told me the name of each one she could still remember, and she made me promise I would never let anyone disturb this place. Jennifer shook her head impatiently. Mom, even if that story were true, you can't just block the city's progress because of things that happened over 100 years ago. Yes, I can, daughter, and I will block it. Because there are things more important than progress. There are things more important than money. Mr. Anthony, who had been listening to the whole conversation, approached Mrs. Dorothy. Mrs. Dorothy, I remember your grandmother telling similar stories. My mother always said this part of town had a different energy, that it was a sacred place. Jennifer looked at Mr. Anthony with irritation. Mr. Anthony, please don't encourage my mother's fantasy. Jennifer, it might not be fantasy. My family has been here for 4 generations too, and we've always heard stories about this location. Dr. Richard decided to intervene again. Well, regardless of whether the stories are true or not, the fact is that Mrs. Dorothy is putting herself at risk with this behavior. She could get hurt moving these carts of sand, and besides, she's spending her entire retirement on a project that won't stop the expropriation. Mrs. Dorothy looked at the psychiatrist with determination. Doctor, I'd rather get hurt protecting what I believe in than sit by and watch the destruction of everything that is sacred to my family. At that moment, another person arrived at the commotion. It was Sebastian, a journalist from the small local newspaper who had received an anonymous call about the unusual situation on Mrs. Dorothy's street. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sebastian from the St. Mary's Chronicle. Can I tell me what's going on here? Jennifer immediately approached the journalist. Journalist, my mother needs medical help. She's having some mental problems and is doing nonsensical things. Please don't publish anything about this." But Daniel stepped forward. "That's not true. My grandmother is protecting a very important historical site." Sebastian became interested. "Historical site? Can you explain better?" Mrs. Dorothy looked at the journalist and decided she had nothing left to lose. "Young man, beneath this house is buried the memory of people who were enslaved here in this region, people who never had the right to a dignified funeral, whose stories were never told. The city wants to tear down this house to build a shopping mall, and I cannot allow that to happen." Sebastian took a notepad from his pocket and began to write. "And do you have any proof of this story?" "I have my grandmother's word, who had her grandmother's word. I have the oral tradition of my family, passed down from generation to generation." "Mrs. Dorothy, oral tradition is not considered historical proof," Dr. Richard interjected. "To me, it's proof enough, Doctor. And it's proof enough for me to dedicate the rest of my life to protecting this place." Sebastian continued asking questions, growing more and more interested in the story. He was a young journalist, recently graduated, who had arrived in town not long ago looking for interesting stories to build his career. That story had all the elements he was looking for: human conflict, historical interest, and a courageous protagonist facing the system. "Mrs. Dorothy, would you allow me to publish your story in the newspaper?" Jennifer became desperate. "No, please don't publish this. It will be an embarrassment for our family." But Mrs. Dorothy did not hesitate. "You may publish it, young man. I want everyone to know why I'm doing this. I want them to understand it's not madness, it's respect for the memory of those who came before us." Sebastian spent 2 more hours talking with Mrs. Dorothy, noting every detail of the story she told him. When he left, he had already decided that would be the front-page story for the following week's edition. Jennifer and Dr. Richard also left, but not before Jennifer made one final threat. "Mother, I will return tomorrow with a court order to have you committed, and I will bring the bailiff to remove all this sand. You are going too far." After everyone had left, Mrs. Dorothy and Daniel were alone on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mounds of sand protecting the house. "Grandma, are you afraid of what will happen tomorrow?" "I am, Daniel, but I'm more afraid of not having enough courage to do what's right." "What if they bring the machines anyway? How will we stop them?" Mrs. Dorothy was silent for a long time, looking at the slowly darkening sky. "Daniel, sometimes in life we have to make sacrifices to protect what is greater than ourselves. Tomorrow may be one of those days. I'll stay here with you, Grandma, no matter what happens. Daniel, you are 15. You have your whole life ahead of you. You can't risk yourself because of an old stubborn woman's battles. You're not an old stubborn woman, Grandma. You are the bravest person I know." That night, grandmother and grandson slept little. Mrs. Dorothy kept thinking about all the stories her grandmother had told her about Harriet and the others who were buried there. She remembered how her grandmother would cry when she spoke of the lack of dignity those people had in life, and how important it was that at least in their departure they had peace. Daniel, for his part, wondered what it would be like to face the City Hall machinery. He knew his presence there would complicate things for Mrs. Dorothy, but he couldn't abandon his grandmother at a moment like that. At 5 in the morning, they were both awakened by the sound of engines in the street. They looked out the window and saw 3 trucks parked in front of the house. One of them carried a backhoe. The other 2 brought a team of City Hall workers. Mrs. Dorothy dressed quickly and went out to the porch. Daniel followed her. "Good morning," said the team foreman. "Are you Mrs. Dorothy?" "That's me. I have an order from the City Hall to remove all this sand from the property. Please step aside so we can do our work." "I will not step aside. This is my property and no one told me to put sand here." "Mrs. Dorothy, you are committing an environmental violation and causing visual pollution. Either remove the sand voluntarily or we will have to remove it with equipment." "You can bring whatever equipment you want. I'm not moving." Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing. The foreman was at a loss. He wasn't prepared to deal with the resistance of a determined elderly woman. He took out his cell phone and called someone at the City Hall explaining the situation. Meanwhile, Daniel positioned himself beside his grandmother. Together they formed a human barrier in front of the mounds of sand. Gradually, neighbors began to appear on the street, drawn by the noise of the trucks. Martha Johnson, Betty from the bakery, Mr. Harold from the hardware store, Mr. Anthony, and several other residents approached to see what was happening. "Mrs. Dorothy, what are these men doing here?" asked Martha Johnson. "They want to take my sand, Martha. They want to destroy my protection." "Protection from what?" Daniel spoke up. "Mrs. Martha, our house is built on a site where enslaved people were buried over 100 years ago. My grandmother is protecting the memory of those people." Some neighbors exchanged skeptical glances, but Mr. Anthony positioned himself beside Mrs. Dorothy. "If Mrs. Dorothy says it's important, then it's important. I'm staying here with her." Betty from the bakery, initially skeptical, began to remember old conversations. "Wait a minute. My mother always said this part of town was different. She said it had the energy of ancestors around here." Mr. Harold also approached. "Mrs. Dorothy, if you are protecting something sacred, I support you." Within minutes, a small support group had formed around Mrs. Dorothy and Daniel. The City Hall foreman grew even more nervous. "Folks, please step back. We have a legal order to carry out." "And we have the right to be on our neighbor's property," replied Mr. Anthony. At that moment, 2 cars arrived at once. From the first one stepped Jennifer, accompanied by a court officer and 2 men in suits. From the second car stepped Sebastian, the journalist, accompanied by a photographer. Jennifer immediately addressed the court officer. "Officer, as we agreed, I want you to remove my mother from this dangerous situation and arrange for compulsory commitment." The officer approached Mrs. Dorothy with a document in hand. "Ma'am, I have here a court order mandating your removal from this property for compulsory psychiatric evaluation." Mrs. Dorothy looked at the paper and then at Jennifer. "Daughter, you really did this to me." "I did it for your own good, Mother. You are ill and need treatment." Daniel was outraged. "Mom, how could you do such a thing? Grandma isn't sick. She's protecting our history." "Daniel, you are a minor. You have no right to weigh in on adult decisions." Sebastian took advantage of the confusion to start taking pictures and asking questions to everyone involved. The situation was turning into a circus, exactly what he wanted for his story. The court officer tried to approach Mrs. Dorothy, but she refused to move from in front of the piles of sand. "Mrs. Dorothy, please cooperate. This will be better for everyone. I will not cooperate with the destruction of my ancestors' memory. Ma'am, the law is the law. You must obey." Mr. Anthony positioned himself between the officer and Mrs. Dorothy. "Officer, this woman is not doing anything wrong. She is on her property, protecting what she believes is sacred. Sir, please do not interfere with the execution of a court order." The tension was rising by the minute. The backhoe had already been unloaded and was being positioned to start removing the sand. Mrs. Dorothy looked at the machine with determination. "If you want to take the sand, you'll have to take me with it." And with that sentence, she lay down on top of the largest pile of sand, hugging it as if it were a loved one. Daniel immediately lay down beside her. The scene left everyone stunned. The backhoe operator stopped the engine and got down from the machine. "Boss, I'm not going to remove sand with people on top. That's not in my contract." The city official called his superiors again, explaining that the situation had gotten out of control. On the other end of the line, they told him to resolve the issue by any means necessary, as there was a lot of money involved in the mall project. Sebastian took the opportunity to take several pictures of the scene, Mrs. Dorothy and Daniel hugging the sand pile, the neighbors forming a human chain of protection. The city's machines stopped, Jennifer crying in frustration. "This will be the front page photo," he murmured to the photographer. The situation remained at a standstill for over 2 hours. Mrs. Dorothy and Daniel wouldn't get off the sand. The neighbors wouldn't let anyone approach. The court officer didn't know how to execute the order without using physical force against an elderly woman. And the city official received increasingly nervous calls from his bosses. It was then that something unexpected happened. A car with Richmond plates arrived, from which an older man with graying hair got out. wearing a dress shirt and carrying a briefcase of documents. "Excuse me, my name is Dr. Albert Morrison. I am a historian and a retired professor from Virginia State University. I came here because I read a news story about this situation in your online newspaper." Sebastian immediately approached. "Dr. Albert, do you know anything about the story Mrs. Dorothy is telling?" "Yes, I do, young man. And I came here to say she is absolutely right to protect this place." Everyone fell silent, paying attention to what the historian had to say. "Everyone, I have spent the last 30 years researching the history of slavery in the interior of Virginia. This region of St. Mary's Ridge was an important center of agricultural production based on slave labor during the 18th and 19th centuries." Jennifer approached the professor. "Doctor, but that doesn't prove there is anything under this specific house." "Actually, it does, Mum. I have here historical documents that prove this area was known as the sacred ground of the forgotten. It was where enslaved people who had no right to the official city cemetery were buried." Mrs. Dorothy slowly rose from the sand pile, tears in her eyes. "Doctor, are you telling the truth?" "Yes, I am, Mrs. Dorothy, and more. The oral tradition you have preserved is extremely valuable to history. Few families have kept this kind of memory alive for so many generations." The court officer was at a loss. "Doctor, does this change anything regarding the court order?" "Everything changes, officer. If this location has proven historical value, it cannot be destroyed. There is federal legislation that protects archaeological sites. The city official in charge got nervous." "Archaeological site? That's an exaggeration." "It's not an exaggeration. Any location where ancient human burials exist is considered an archaeological site by American legislation, and that means any intervention here needs to be authorized by federal historical preservation agencies." Sebastian was having the day of his professional life. That story was becoming much bigger than he had imagined. "Dr. Albert, can you explain exactly what documents these are that prove the history?" "Of course, I have here registry office records from the imperial era, old city maps, and even reports from European travelers who passed through here and described the region's funeral customs." Mrs. Dorothy approached the professor with an expression of profound gratitude. "Doctor, all these years people thought I was making up stories. They thought I was going crazy." "Mrs. Dorothy, you were preserving a part of American history that was almost lost. Oral tradition is one of the most important ways to keep the memory of our ancestors alive." Daniel also stood up from the sand and approached the professor. "Doctor, does this mean my grandmother was right all along?" "It means your grandmother is a heroine of historical preservation, young man." Jennifer stayed silent, processing everything she was hearing. For the first time, she began to consider that perhaps her mother wasn't delusional. "Dr. Albert, assuming all this is true, what is the correct procedure to protect this location?" "The procedure is to file a request with the National Heritage Preservation Institute for an archaeological study of the area. In the meantime, nothing can be touched here." The city official in charge grabbed his phone and made a nervous call. On the other end of the line, someone was shouting. He replied a few times with, "Yes, sir," and "I understand, sir," before hanging up. "Everyone, I've received orders to suspend work until further notice. Let's pack up the equipment." Mrs. Dorothy couldn't contain her emotion. She began to cry, but this time they were tears of relief. "Daniel, I think we did it, my grandson. I think we managed to protect our ancestors." The neighbors who had supported Mrs. Dorothy began to celebrate. Mr. Anthony gave the elderly woman a hug. "Mrs. Dorothy, you are a woman of strength. Congratulations for not giving up." Sebastian approached Professor Albert. "Doctor, can you give me a more detailed interview about this story?" "Of course, young man, and I suggest you get in touch with other historians from the region. This discovery could change a lot of what we know about the history of St. Mary's Ridge." Jennifer approached her mother, still visibly shaken. "Mom, I need to apologize. I didn't believe you." "Daughter, you didn't know. I should have explained better from the start." "You tried to explain, Mom. I was the one who didn't want to listen." Daniel watched the reconciliation between mother and grandmother with joy. But he knew that was only the first victory in a fight that was still far from over. Grandma, and now, what will happen to the Mall project? Now, Daniel, the law will protect this place, and our family will continue to be the guardians of our ancestors' memory. Dr. Albert approached Mrs. Dorothy with a proposal. Mrs. Dorothy, would you like to collaborate on an academic research project about this location? Your family memory could help us build a very precise historical map. Of course, Doctor. It would be an honor. Sebastian was already imagining the impact his article would have. A story like that could even be published in national newspapers. When everyone had left, Mrs. Dorothy and Daniel were alone again, gazing at the mounds of sand that now held a completely different meaning. Grandma, did you always know this would work out? No, Daniel. I only knew it was the right thing to do. Sometimes that's enough, doing what's right, even when everyone thinks you're wrong. And the sand, shall we remove it now? Mrs. Dorothy looked at the protection she had built with so much effort. No, my grandson. We'll leave the sand until the archaeologists come to conduct the study. It is still fulfilling its function of protecting our ancestors. That night, Mrs. Dorothy slept better than she had in weeks. For the first time since learning of the Mall project, she felt that the memory of Harriet and the others was safe. The next morning, Mrs. Dorothy's story occupied the front page of the local newspaper with the headline, "Elderly Woman Protects Archaeological Site with Sand Piles." Sebastian's article was so well written that it caught the attention of media outlets across the state. Within 3 days, the story had spread through social media and reached the country's major newspapers. Mrs. Dorothy became a national celebrity, called Guardian of Memory and Heroine of Historical Preservation. The mayor of St. Mary's Ridge, who had initially supported the Mall project, completely changed his tune when he saw the positive reception of the story. He began saying he had always been in favor of historical preservation and that the city was proud to have a citizen like Mrs. Dorothy. The Mall project was definitively cancelled after the National Heritage Preservation Institute declared the area of archaeological interest. The construction company tried to challenge the decision, but was unsuccessful. 2 weeks after the confrontation with the city's machinery, the first archaeologists arrived to begin the studies. Mrs. Dorothy welcomed them into her home as if they were old friends. Mrs. Dorothy, we will need to carefully remove the sand to conduct the excavations. Do you authorize it? Yes, I authorize it. Now I know you will treat our ancestors with the respect they deserve. The excavations lasted 3 months. Throughout this entire period, Mrs. Dorothy followed the work daily, providing information based on her family's oral tradition. To the archaeologists' surprise, the information proved extremely accurate. The remains of 16 people were found, along with personal items, tools, and even some pottery pieces made by the enslaved individuals themselves. Each discovery confirmed more and more the truth of the stories Mrs. Dorothy had preserved. The most moving find was a small cloth doll found beside the remains of a child. Mrs. Dorothy immediately recognized the object. This doll belonged to Harriet's little daughter. My grandmother told me the girl passed from this life very young, and that Harriet made this doll especially to be buried with her. The archaeologists were impressed by the precision of the family memory. Professor Albert, who coordinated the excavations, told the press that this was one of the best preserved archaeological sites he had ever studied. During the excavations, Mrs. Dorothy received visits from scholars from across the United States. Her home became a reference point for researchers interested in the history of slavery in the interior of Virginia. Daniel, who had been part of the entire journey from the beginning, decided he wanted to pursue a career in history or archaeology. The experience of helping preserve the memory of his ancestors had awakened in him a passion for historical knowledge. Jennifer, in turn, learned to value her family's roots. She began making more frequent visits to St. Mary's Ridge and became actively involved in the project to preserve the archaeological site. When the excavations were completed, the federal government approved the creation of a memorial at the location. Mrs. Dorothy was invited to be the project coordinator, a role she accepted with great emotion. The memorial was inaugurated 1 year later, with the presence of state and federal authorities. Mrs. Dorothy gave a moving speech at the ceremony. This place represents much more than ancient history. It represents the importance of giving voice to those who were silenced. It represents the responsibility we all have to preserve the memory of those who came before us. The century-old house was restored and became part of the memorial. Visitors can learn not only about the archaeological findings, but also the story of how Mrs. Dorothy managed to protect that heritage. The memorial project generated jobs in the town and attracted tourists from the entire region. What was once seen as an obstacle to progress became the greatest cultural heritage of St. Mary's Ridge. 2 years after the inauguration, Mrs. Dorothy received a tribute from the federal government for her services to the preservation of the national historical memory. At the ceremony in Washington, D.C., she was accompanied by Daniel, who was already studying history at university, and Jennifer, who had become one of the memorial's main advocates. "I never thought I would live to see this day," said Mrs. Dorothy in her acceptance speech. "When I started dumping sand around my house, people thought I was crazy. Today I know that sometimes you have to seem crazy to do what's right." Mrs. Dorothy's story became a national example of how an ordinary person can make a difference in preserving history and culture. Her memorial receives thousands of visitors per year, all interested in learning both about the archaeological findings and the story of the courageous woman who protected them. The sand that was once a subject of jokes became a symbol of resistance and preservation. And Mrs. Dorothy, who was once considered crazy by her neighbors, is now remembered as a heroine of the national memory. Daniel, with a degree in history, took over the academic direction of the memorial. Jennifer left corporate law to dedicate herself to law, focused on the preservation of historical heritage. And Mrs. Dorothy, at 75 years old, continues working every day at the memorial, telling visitors the stories her grandmother taught her. The place where a shopping center was once going to be built now houses one of the most important research centers on the history of slavery in the interior of the United States. And all of this was possible because a stubborn, elderly woman decided to protect with sand what she considered sacred. The oral tradition of Mrs. Dorothy's family was documented and became a reference for other studies on the preservation of family memory. Universities from across the country send students to conduct research at the memorial. The government of Virginia created a state program for the protection of oral memory, inspired by Mrs. Dorothy's story. The program seeks to identify and protect other families that preserve important historical traditions. Mrs. Dorothy also won several national and international awards for her historical preservation work, but she always says the greatest award was being able to keep the promise she made to her grandmother when she was a child. 5 years after the whole story began, the memorial had already received over 100,000 visitors. The town of St. Mary's Ridge is proud to house that heritage, and Mrs. Dorothy became the most famous citizen of the town. Daniel, now a history graduate with a specialization in archaeology, defended his master's thesis on the archaeological site discovered beneath his grandmother's house. The work was considered one of the most important academic contributions on the history of slavery in Virginia. Jennifer opened a law office specializing in historical and cultural heritage law. Her first major case was precisely the legal defense of the memorial created by her mother. The company that wanted to build the shopping mall tried to sue the family for damages, but was unsuccessful. The project was considered irregular from the start for not taking into account the archaeological potential of the area. The mayor, who had initially supported the mall project, lost the re-election. His successor made the preservation of historical heritage one of the main banners of his administration. Mrs. Dorothy, now 77 years old, continues to live in the same century-old house, which is now part of the memorial complex. She wakes up every morning knowing she has fulfilled her mission to protect the memory of her ancestors. Mrs. Dorothy's story has been turned into a book, a documentary, and even a play. All the works highlight the importance of individual determination in preserving collective memory. The memorial also developed an educational program that serves schools throughout the region. Children learn about the history of slavery through the stories told by Mrs. Dorothy herself. Daniel created an oral history project that documents the family memories of other descendants of the enslaved in the region. The work has already identified dozens of families with important historical traditions. Jennifer became one of the leading specialists in archaeological heritage protection legislation in the country. She advises other communities facing situations similar to what her family experienced. The land where the mall was to be built now houses, in addition to the memorial, a research center, a library specializing in the history of slavery, and an archive of oral traditions. The local university created an extension course on family memory preservation, coordinated by Daniel, and with the regular participation of Mrs. Dorothy as a guest speaker. The case of St. Mary's Ridge became a national and international reference on how to reconcile urban development with historical preservation. Experts from all over the world visit the city to study the model developed there. Mrs. Dorothy received the Dr. Honoris Causa title from Virginia State University for her work in preserving historical memory. At the ceremony, she said that was the fulfillment of a dream she didn't even know she had. The memorial also conducts research on other old properties in the city, identifying sites with archaeological and historical potential. Several important discoveries have already been made based on leads from the local oral tradition. Mrs. Dorothy's house has become one of the most visited tourist attractions in the interior of Virginia. Visitors from all over the United States and abroad come to see the place where a courageous elderly woman changed the history of her town. The wheelbarrow that Mrs. Dorothy used to transport the sand has been preserved and is on display at the memorial as a symbol of individual determination in preserving collective memory. The sand that protected the house for months was carefully sifted by archaeologists and helped date the findings. Part of it was preserved in a glass dome as part of the permanent exhibition. Archaeological excavations continue to happen periodically, always under the supervision of Mrs. Dorothy, who provides information based on her family's oral tradition. The memorial project inspired the creation of a municipal law that requires all new developments in the city to conduct archaeological impact studies before any construction. Daniel defended his doctoral thesis on the importance of oral tradition in preserving historical memory, using his own family's story as the primary example. Jennifer became a consultant for the federal government on issues related to the protection of archaeological heritage on private properties. Her work helped create new legal frameworks for similar situations. The memorial developed an exchange program with foreign universities, hosting researchers interested in studying models for preserving the memory of slavery. Mrs. Dorothy was invited to participate in international conferences on historical heritage preservation. In every lecture, she tells how she began by covering her house with sand to protect the memory of her ancestors. The city of St. Mary's Ridge became a reference for historical and cultural tourism, attracting visitors interested in both the memorial and Mrs. Dorothy's inspiring story. The memorial's educational program has already served over 10,000 students, helping to raise a new generation aware of the importance of historical preservation. Daniel created an app that allows visitors to learn the history of the memorial through augmented reality, hearing Mrs. Dorothy's own words as they walk through the site. Jennifer coordinates a national network of lawyers specializing in heritage law, offering free advisory services to communities needing to protect their historical sites. The memorial established partnerships with national and international museums, allowing part of its collection to be displayed in exhibitions worldwide. Mrs. Dorothy's story became required reading in the curricula of history, archaeology, and heritage preservation courses at several American universities. The federal government created a national program for identifying and protecting archaeological sites based on the model developed in St. Mary's Ridge. Mrs. Dorothy, at 80 years old, remains actively involved in all the memorial's activities, always reminding visitors that it all began with the promise she made to her grandmother as a child. The century-old house was completely restored using traditional construction techniques, preserving its original architecture while housing the memorial's administrative center. The memorial's architectural design won national and international awards for how it integrates historical preservation, modern functionality, and respect for ancestral memory. Daniel developed a research methodology based on combining oral tradition with scientific archaeology, which is being applied at other historical sites across the United States. Jennifer wrote a book on the legal aspects of archaeological heritage preservation, which has become a reference for lawyers and public administrators. The memorial created a scholarship program for low-income students interested in careers related to historical preservation, perpetuating Mrs. Dorothy's legacy. The oral tradition preserved by Mrs. Dorothy was included in the Register of Intangible Cultural Assets of the United States, officially recognizing its cultural importance. The memorial's participatory management model, with Mrs. Dorothy and the local community actively involved, became a reference for other historical preservation projects. The company that wanted to build the shopping mall ended up developing a housing project in another area of the city, respecting the historical preservation guidelines created after the memorial case. Mrs. Dorothy's wheelbarrow inspired the creation of a sculpture in the city's central square, honoring all the workers who built the local history. Mrs. Dorothy's lectures on preserving family memory are broadcast online, reaching thousands of people interested in valuing their own family traditions. Daniel coordinates an international exchange project between communities preserving memories of the African diaspora, connecting St. Mary's Ridge with similar projects in other countries. Jennifer founded an NGO dedicated to the legal protection of threatened heritage sites, offering free legal counsel to communities in situations similar to what her family faced. The memorial developed a training program for tour guides specializing in the history of slavery, qualifying professionals to meet the growing interest in the subject. The discovery of the archaeological site led to the identification of other historical locations in the region, creating a cultural tourism circuit that benefits several neighboring towns. Mrs. Dorothy gained an official biography, written by a renowned American historian, which became a national bestseller and was translated into several languages. The memorial project inspired the creation of a state public policy for valuing oral tradition as a source of historical preservation. Daniel received a postdoctoral fellowship to study African oral traditions in Africa, deepening knowledge about the cultural origins of his family's ancestors. Jennifer became a university professor, teaching cultural heritage law and training new specialists in the field. The memorial established a genetic research program that helps descendants of enslaved people trace their family origins, using information preserved in the local oral tradition. The methodology developed in St. Mary's Ridge to combine oral tradition with archaeological research is being applied in similar projects in Africa and the Americas. Mrs. Dorothy was invited by UNESCO to join an international council on intangible heritage preservation, bringing her experience to the world stage. The success of the memorial led to the creation of a technical course in historical preservation at the local school, training young people specialized in the area. Mrs. Dorothy's story inspired the creation of a federal law that establishes special protection for sites identified through verified oral tradition. Daniel defended a second doctoral thesis, this time on the importance of women in preserving historical memory, using his grandmother as the primary example. Jennifer coordinates an international legal exchange program on cultural rights, taking the American experience to other countries. The memorial created a digital archive that preserves not only the oral tradition of Mrs. Dorothy's family, but also of hundreds of other families in the region. The discovery of the archaeological site significantly changed academic knowledge about the African presence in the interior of Virginia during the colonial and imperial periods. Mrs. Dorothy, at 82 years old, continues to live in the century-old house, now transformed into a national symbol of resistance and memory preservation. The memorial's educational project expanded to include teacher training, equipping educators from across the region to work with heritage education. Daniel developed a mobile application that allows families to document and preserve their own oral traditions, democratizing access to historical preservation tools. Jennifer coordinates an international network for the protection of threatened heritage sites, connecting lawyers and activists from various countries. The St. Mary's Ridge model was studied and adapted by Quilombola communities across the United States, strengthening the protection of their territories and traditions. Mrs. Dorothy's house was declared a cultural heritage of the United States, guaranteeing permanent federal protection for the place where it all began. The wheelbarrow that transported the protective sand became a national symbol of the struggle for historical preservation, being replicated in monuments across the country. The memorial's archaeological excavations contributed to the formation of a new generation of archaeologists specialized in sites related to slavery. Mrs. Dorothy received the title of honorary citizen from several American cities that developed projects inspired by her story. The memorial's oral tradition program has already documented over 1,000 family histories, creating one of the most important collections of its kind in the country. Daniel became an international reference in the archaeology of slavery, teaching courses and giving lectures at universities around the world. Jennifer founded a publishing house specializing in research on cultural heritage and historical memory, democratizing access to academic knowledge. The memorial developed a sustainable agriculture program based on traditional African techniques, connecting historical preservation with local economic development. The oral tradition preserved by Mrs. Dorothy was included in school curricula as an example of how family memory can contribute to historical knowledge. The memorial's architectural design influenced a new school of American heritage architecture, which prioritizes the harmonious integration between preservation and modern functionality. Mrs. Dorothy was honored with a commemorative coin minted by the United States Mint, recognizing her contribution to the preservation of national memory. The memorial's participatory management model, with strong community involvement, became a reference for public cultural policies across the country. The discovery of the archaeological site led to the creation of a master's program in the archaeology of slavery at the regional university, attracting students from around the world. Daniel coordinates an international network of researchers dedicated to the study of the African diaspora in the Americas, with the memorial as a reference center. Jennifer became a UN consultant on issues related to the protection of cultural rights of traditional communities. The memorial's educational program inspired the creation of a national methodology for heritage education based on personal stories and family traditions. Mrs. Dorothy's century-old house was transformed into a living laboratory of traditional construction techniques, offering courses for architects and engineers interested in heritage. The memorial established partnerships with museums in Africa for the exchange of collections and knowledge about the culture of the ancestors of enslaved Americans. Mrs. Dorothy, even at 85 years old, continues to receive visitors daily, sharing her story and inspiring new generations of memory preservers. The methodology developed at the Memorial for the Scientific Validation of Oral Traditions is being applied in archaeological projects on several continents. Daniel published an encyclopedia on archaeological sites related to slavery in the United States, a work that has become a mandatory reference in the field. Jennifer coordinates a legal training program for community leaders, teaching them how to use heritage protection laws to defend their territories. The success of the memorial led to the creation of a national tourist route of sites related to the memory of slavery, connecting dozens of cities across the country. The oral tradition of Mrs. Dorothy's family was turned into an opera, performed in national and international theaters as a form of art engaged with historical memory. The memorial project inspired the creation of a federal public policy for mapping and protecting archaeological sites on private properties. Mrs. Dorothy was invited to speak at the UN General Assembly about the importance of preserving cultural memory, taking her message to the world's highest forum. The St. Mary's Ridge model became a case study in cultural management and public policy courses at universities worldwide. Daniel developed a revolutionary technique of participatory archaeology, which includes the local community as an active part of the scientific research process. Jennifer created an international legal protocol for protecting heritage identified through oral tradition, adopted by several countries. The memorial established an exchange program with indigenous communities, sharing knowledge about preserving oral traditions and ancestral cultural practices. Mrs. Dorothy's house became a pilgrimage site for people interested in connecting with their family roots and valuing their own traditions. The original wheelbarrow was preserved in a special display case at the memorial, but replicas are used in annual ceremonies, renewing the commitment to historical preservation. The memorial's archaeological excavations contributed to rewriting the official history of Virginia, including for the first time the perspective of the enslaved in the state's historical narrative. Mrs. Dorothy received the Dr. Honoris Causa title from universities on 3 continents, internationally recognizing her contribution to the preservation of human memory. The memorial's heritage education program expanded to include online training, reaching teachers and students across the entire national territory. Daniel became director of an international research institute on African diaspora archaeology, headquartered at the St. Mary's Ridge Memorial itself. Jennifer founded a law school specialized in cultural rights, training a new generation of lawyers committed to heritage protection. The model developed at the memorial to reconcile urban development with historical preservation was adopted as official policy by dozens of American municipalities. The oral tradition preserved by Mrs. Dorothy inspired the creation of a national program to value family memories as intangible cultural heritage. The memorial created a genetic research center that helps descendants of enslaved Africans reconstruct their family trees using historical data and oral traditions. Mrs. Dorothy, at 90 years old, continues to be the memorial's main guide, telling her story to thousands of visitors who arrive annually from all over the world. The discovery of the St. Mary's Ridge archaeological site changed academic paradigms about the importance of oral tradition as a valid and reliable historical source. Daniel coordinates a global network of memory preservers, connecting people from different cultures who work to keep their ancestors' traditions alive. Jennifer became the United States Secretary of Culture, bringing to the federal government the experience gained in protecting her own family's heritage. The memorial developed a historical agriculture program that recreates traditional African farming techniques, connecting cultural preservation with environmental sustainability. Mrs. Dorothy's century-old house was transformed into a living museum, where visitors can experience what daily life was like for descendants of Africans in the American interior. The memorial's educational project has already trained over 100,000 people in historical awareness and heritage preservation, creating a national network of multipliers. Mrs. Dorothy received the Nobel Peace Prize for her work in preserving historical memory and promoting racial reconciliation through education. The methodology developed at the memorial to integrate oral tradition, archaeology, and education became UNESCO's official model for similar projects worldwide. Daniel published an autobiography about growing up in a family of memory preservers, a work that has become required reading in heritage educator training courses. Jennifer oversees an international cultural rights tribunal, judging cases of heritage destruction and violation of traditional communities' rights. The success of the memorial inspired the creation of a university specialized in African diaspora studies, attracting students and researchers from all continents. The oral tradition of Mrs. Dorothy Mitchell's family was declared an intangible heritage of humanity by UNESCO, recognizing its universal importance. The model of St. Mary's Ridge revolutionized urban archaeology practices, demonstrating how small discoveries can have monumental historical impact. Mrs. Dorothy, even as a centenarian, continues every morning walking through the memorial gardens, checking that everything is being properly preserved for future generations. The house where it all began became a worldwide symbol of the importance of individual determination in preserving humanity's collective memory. The wheelbarrow that carried the protective sand was replicated in monuments all over the world, representing the strength of individual action against the destruction of historical heritage. The archaeological excavations continue to reveal new aspects of the ancestors' lives, always under the loving supervision of Mrs. Dorothy, who never forgot the promise made to her grandmother. The St. Mary's Ridge Memorial established itself as the world's most important research center on preserving the memory of slavery through oral tradition. Daniel became the dean of the first international university dedicated exclusively to African diaspora studies, with his grandmother's work as fundamental inspiration. Jennifer was elected president of an international organization for the protection of cultural rights, bringing to the world stage the lessons learned in her small hometown. The memorial's educational program expanded to include trainer training, creating a global network of educators specialized in the history of slavery. Mrs. Dorothy's house became an annual meeting place for descendants of Africans from all over the world, connecting people through shared memory. The participatory management model developed at the memorial influenced the cultural policies of dozens of countries, democratizing access to heritage preservation. Mrs. Dorothy, at 105 years old, still receives daily letters and visits from people inspired by her story, confirming that her mission to preserve memory has endured far beyond her own life. The oral tradition she protected with such determination became a source of historical knowledge for future generations, definitively fulfilling the promise made to her grandmother almost a century ago. The sand that once caused laughter and jokes transformed into the most powerful symbol of the importance of protecting our ancestral memory, proving that sometimes the greatest revolutions begin with the simplest and seemingly most insignificant gestures. End of story. And you, what did you think of Mrs. Dorothy's determination? Do you believe she made the right choice in protecting the memory of her ancestors? Leave your honest opinion in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Your participation is very important to us. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories like this one.